The Collector. It wasn't the kind of house you'd expect to find on such a quiet suburban street. Tucked between two pristine lawns with white picket fences and carefully tended flower beds, house number 17 stood out like a wound that refused to heal. Its windows were perpetually dark, the yard overgrown and choked with weeds. The curtains never moved, and no one ever saw the owner, except for brief glimpses late at night when the lights flickered on for a few minutes before vanishing again. The neighborhood kids dared each other to knock on the door, but no one ever had the nerve. There were rumors, of course, stories about the man who lived there. They called him the Collector. Some said he was a hoarder who kept mountains of trash inside. Others whispered that he collected body parts. No one knew for sure, but no one was brave enough to find out. Except for Ethan. Ethan had just moved to the neighborhood and didn't believe in urban legends. He was 16, bored, and looking for something to do on a cold Saturday night. When his new friends dared him to knock on the door of house number 17, he shrugged and agreed. The rain started to fall as he made his way up the cracked stone path to the front door. His friends stood at the edge of the yard, laughing and egging him on. "Go on, Ethan, knock and say hi to the Collector." He rolled his eyes, raising his fist to knock on the weathered wooden door. It was wet and slimy to the touch, but before he could knock, the door creaked open on its own. The laughter behind him stopped. "Hello?" Ethan called out, peering into the dark hallway beyond. The air smelled damp and metallic, like rusted iron. No response. "Dude, don't go in there," one of his friends called. But Ethan grinned, looking back over his shoulder. "What, are you guys scared?" He stepped inside, the floorboards groaning under his weight. The door slammed shut behind him. Inside, the house was silent, except for the sound of rain dripping through the roof. The hallway was lined with shelves, and as Ethan's eyes adjusted to the dim light, he realized they were filled with jars. Hundreds of jars. Each jar was labeled with neat, precise handwriting on faded paper. Eyes, teeth, fingers, tongues. He froze, his stomach churning. Surely this was a joke, some kind of elaborate prank set up by the guy who lived here. He leaned in closer to one of the jars. Floating inside was what looked like a perfectly preserved eyeball, the optic nerve curling like a grotesque tail. Ethan swallowed hard and turned to leave, but the hallway seemed longer now, stretching endlessly into the dark. The door he'd entered through was gone. "Hey," he called, his voice echoing. "This isn't funny." A soft rustling sound came from the shadows ahead, like someone, or something, moving. "Hello?" Ethan whispered, his bravado crumbling. The shadows shifted and a figure emerged. It was a man, but not entirely. His body was thin, stretched too tall, his limbs unnaturally long. His face was pale and smooth, almost waxy, with deep hollow pits where his eyes should have been. He wore a tattered suit, and in his hands he held a jar. The jar wasn't empty. Inside was a human hand, its fingers curled as though mid-grasp. "Another one for the collection," the man said, his voice soft and almost kind. He stepped closer, and Ethan stumbled backward, tripping over the edge of a rug. "Stay away!" Ethan shouted, scrambling to his feet. The man tilted his head, as if confused. Then he smiled, a wide, unnatural grin that revealed rows of small, sharp teeth. "You came into my home, boy. That makes you mine." Ethan turned and ran, his heart pounding as the hallway seemed to stretch even longer. The shelves loomed on either side of him, the jars rattling as if something inside was desperate to escape. The soft, deliberate footsteps of the Collector followed close behind. "You shouldn't have come here," the voice whispered in his ear, though he dared not look back. "They all think it's just a story, but you know better now, don't you?" The hallway suddenly ended, and Ethan found himself in a room. The walls were covered with photographs, black and white, curling at the edges. He moved closer to one and froze in horror. It was a picture of himself, taken that very night, standing on the doorstep of the house. "How?" he choked out, his voice barely above a whisper. The Collector's shadow loomed behind him, impossibly tall, impossibly close. "I collect memories too," he murmured, and Ethan felt something cold press against his shoulder. He screamed as the world around him went dark. The next morning, Ethan's friends waited by the edge of the yard, hoping he would come out with some wild story about what he'd seen. But Ethan didn't come out. Weeks passed, and eventually a new photo appeared on the walls of the hallway in house number 17. In it, Ethan's face was frozen in a silent scream, his eyes wide with terror. Below the photo, neatly arranged on a shelf, was a jar labeled Hands, and inside, two pale, familiar hands floated in murky liquid. The collector's collection was complete. For now. The Whistling Man. The storm was at its peak when Claire's car broke down in the middle of an isolated mountain road. Rain battered the windshield so hard that even with the wipers at full speed, visibility was close to zero. Her phone had no signal. Of course it didn't. This was the kind of place you only saw in nightmares. Shivering, she pulled her jacket tighter around herself and looked out into the dark forest that surrounded her. The trees swayed violently in the wind, their skeletal branches clawing at the black sky. The nearest town was miles away, but she couldn't just stay in the car all night. She grabbed her flashlight from the glove compartment, slipped on her boots, and stepped out into the rain. She had only walked a few yards when she heard it, faint, barely audible over the storm. A whistle. It was a simple tune, only a few notes, but it cut through the rain like a blade. She froze, shining her flashlight into the woods, but all she could see were the shadows of trees dancing in the wind. "Hello?" she called, her voice trembling. No answer. The whistle came again, closer this time. The melody was playful, almost cheerful, but there was something unnerving about it, something wrong. It didn't belong in a place like this. Claire's heart pounded in her chest as she quickened her pace, her boots splashing through puddles. She didn't know where she was going, only that she needed to get away from the sound. But the whistle followed her, growing louder, more insistent. And then it stopped. The sudden silence was deafening, and for a moment, all she could hear was the pounding of her heart and the relentless rain. She turned slowly, and her breath caught in her throat. A figure stood at the edge of the trees, barely visible in the beam of her flashlight. He was tall, too tall, and thin, his limbs unnaturally long. He wore a wide-brimmed hat that cast his face in shadow, but she could see his mouth. It was stretched into a grotesque grin, the corners curling upward far too much, as if his skin was being pulled by invisible strings. The whistling started again, but this time, it wasn't coming from the man's mouth. Claire realized, with growing horror, that it was coming from inside her own head. The tune echoed in her skull, louder and louder, until it drowned out everything else. She screamed, but she couldn't even hear her own voice over the maddening whistle. The man moved then, stepping toward her in slow, deliberate strides, his long legs bent at unnatural angles, his feet splashing soundlessly in the puddles. "Stay back!" she shouted, stumbling backward. The whistling changed, the melody becoming slower, darker, more sinister. Claire's head felt like it was splitting open, the sound drilling into her skull. She dropped her flashlight, clutching her head as she fell to her knees. When she looked up, the man was inches from her. She couldn't see his eyes, but she could feel them, two cold, empty voids boring into her soul. His grin widened as he reached out with one impossibly long arm. His fingers were bony, like branches, and when they touched her face, her vision went black. Claire woke up hours later, lying in the middle of the road. The rain had stopped, and the first light of dawn was breaking through the clouds. Her car was gone. She stumbled to her feet, shivering in the cold morning air. Her head throbbed, and when she reached up to touch it, her fingers brushed against something strange. There was a scar, thin and precise, running from one ear to the other, as if her skull had been split open and stitched back together. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. Somehow, it had a signal again. She pulled it out and saw she had a single new message from an unknown number. It was a voice recording. With shaking hands, she pressed play. The whistle started again, the same maddening tune. But this time, it wasn't just in her head. It was coming from everywhere, and she knew he was still watching.